You're listening to Making the Cut, the mostly true life story of a retired surgeon from 1C Productions.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Seitz, founder and president of 1C Productions, where thoughtful entertainment comes alive. Our content, like the show you're about to hear, sometimes includes mature themes and subject matter. This may be offensive to some listeners. It is only intended for mature audiences and has been categorized accordingly. While 1C does not present this material in salacious form, we do include it as the relevant and important story element that it is. I invite you to learn more about this show and other 1C content at just1c.com. That's JUSTONEC.com. And now it is my honor and joy to bring you Making the Cut.
This podcast is brought to you by Coliseum Counsel. Coliseum Counsel is a multifaceted law firm with offices in Naples and Crestview, Florida. Whether it's probate, guardianship, civil litigation, or criminal, let Coliseum Counsel be your one-stop shop to meet all your legal needs. Contact us today to set up a free 30-minute consultation at 239-631-8160.
Tonight's Pod Pair wine selection is a 2017 Russian River Valley Zinfandel from Deloche Vineyards. Its late ripening grapes hung on vines that brambled about the vineyard, a bit like our intrepid hero Michael winding his way through life. To learn more about how these exclusive wines can be delivered straight to your door, visit relaxwithastory.com.
George, my fellow classmate at university, hitchhiked from England through Europe, took a boat across the Mediterranean, and then rode a bus crowded with locals from Alexandria to join me in Cairo. Before medical school, he went to Gordonston in Scotland, known for its daily morning run, cold showers, and discipline. George was fit, lean, energetic, and a loyal friend. He negotiated the world by virtue of his reason. We both lacked the talent for small talk, which suited me just fine.
George and I spent 3 nights in Saida Zinab, feted by my aunts, Tante Mustakima and Tante Suad. Tante Suad was now the only resident in the flat that had once held my large and vibrant Egyptian family. Tante Mustakima lived with her son nearby. They spent most of the day cooking in preparation for our return from local sightseeing trips. In Arab culture, it is customary to leave some food and beverage at a meal. This signals enjoyment and satiation. Indeed, it is impolite to eat everything you are given. George, though, grew up in a home with the ethic of cleaning your plate, like my home with Omar and Opa. He cleaned his plate from the first round of food. Tante Mustakima heaped more food onto it. He cleaned it again. Tante Mustakima put more on. Polite and appreciative, George dutifully consumed the food at a progressively slowing pace. I watched from the opposite side of the table. He respectfully objected to more food with hand signals.
Ooh, tell your aunt I'm full and I can't eat any more. Please.
Just leave it. Tante Mustakima, delighted at his ravenous appetite and appreciation of her cooking, piled even more food onto his empty plate, urging him in Arabic to eat, and then resumed circling the lavish display of delicious dishes that covered the dining room table, much as my short, rotund grandmother, Sit Nazifa, used to do. We were the only guests. Just leave it. Seriously, they expect you to.
I can't. It's so delicious.
The moment she left us alone to go into the kitchen to make Turkish coffee, he stood up moaning and holding his stomach.
Oh, I'm going to burst. I have to lie down on the floor.
No, George. No, you can't do that here.
I'm going to vomit.
I managed to steer him to the open window. Leaning out, he accomplished a huge burp, avoiding a projectile heave into Cairo's night and the Sayyida Zainab flaneurs in the street below. Later that night, we shared my dearly departed Sheikh Amin's large bed. I inhaled the scent that lingered in the camel hair blanket. I missed the inimitable warmth and generosity of spirit he had. His touch, kisses, and blessings lavished munificently upon me, particularly after my father's death. The open window caught the breeze, and brought with it the incessant howling and barking of the wild dog packs that roamed Cairo's surrounding desert, just as they had in the Pharaoh's day. The dogs and the persistent flies prevented us from sleeping soundly until sunrise, when the noise finally ceased, and the flies sought relief elsewhere from the day's coming heat. The next morning, I visited the office of the Minister of State for Youth and Sports at the Mogama. After paying the appropriate tax stamp, I obtained a letter on their official letterhead, authorizing the internal police to facilitate my travels with George, a foreigner, within Egypt. It was typed on official letterhead of the Youth Ministry. What a remarkably different experience from my previous trips to this loathsome building. The letter's two typed lines read, "The Minister authorizes you to assist these youths in their travels about Egypt." George and I saw most of the sites around Cairo: the Pharaonic, the Christian churches, the ancient mosques, and the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities in Midan Tahrir, a stone's throw from the Mogama. Three days later, backpacks filled with Tante Mustakima's goodies, we took the bus to its terminal in Helwan, a major industrial city along the Nile, south of Cairo. We walked through the city to the internal police checkpoint on its southern edge. These checkpoints are barriers on the roads in and out of all major cities, villages, and provinces, regulating traffic, rooting out hashish and gun smuggling, and other illicit trade that might endanger the authorities. The armed internal police stopped all traffic to inspect travel documents, bills of ladings, and goods on trucks while recording plate numbers and drivers' destinations. I sought out the most senior, usually a sergeant, and offered the traditional "Salam alaikum," peace be upon you. I produced the letter, which he briefly glanced at, probably quite familiar with these documents, and asked him to put us on the next truck going south. Our overall plan was to visit Beni Haram, and after a day or so, head further south along the Nile to Luxor. The sergeant yelled orders to his subordinates, and within minutes, George and I were sitting next to the lorry driver, chugging along at breakneck speed south to Upper Egypt. The one-lane blacktop shimmered in the distance under eucalyptus and palm trees, past alfalfa fields, human traffic, donkey-drawn carts, camels and their herders, overflowing onto the center of the road. The Nile lay to our left, swiftly flowing, while the green delta stretched out to the encroaching desert on our right. We barreled along, horn blaring through mud hut villages, where life spilled over onto the road. I put the curious driver at ease. I chatted. Yelling, really. Our security lay in this stranger's hands. George sat by the window, clicking away with his camera, for every scene was new to him. As the day progressed, it became unbearably hot in the cabin. Even the wind, streaming through the open window, felt like blasts from a furnace. After a couple of hours, the driver pulled over at a roadside tea stop, where villagers with stalls sold food, fruit, and iced Pepsi, and where children and flies gathered in multitudes. We piled out, seeking fresh air and shade from the high sun that hung in a clear blue sky. The driver took a few steps off the road and urinated into the alfalfa fields. Before mid-morning prayers, he spread his prayer mat beside the road. Since the custom of touching clean, dry soil suffices as a substitute for ablution, we touched the soil, then wiped our hands and our faces with it. After prayers, we retired to the shade of a huge eucalyptus tree. I bought a round of sweet black tea, traditionally served in a glass with a sprig of mint. I made every effort to establish a good rapport with our driver, even offering some of Tante Mustakima's delicacies, all the while including George by translating our conversation. I watched the dynamic village life around us, while George wandered off with his camera. I had warned him about the folkloric belief that to be photographed was to have one's soul stolen, so he might run into objections. Others could become angry, and still others would demand bakshish. We had discussed our need to buy food from street vendors as we continued our hitchhiking to Luxor and the Red Sea, but I had stressed that we should only consume freshly cooked food, such as roasted sweet potatoes or kebabs of identifiable meat. Watermelons? I had never given that a thought. George consumed these voraciously to quench his thirst, thinking the flesh was sterile and safer than tap water, perhaps forgetting that a knife drags bacteria from the skin into the fruit. Refreshed, we headed back to the lorry. I climbed into the cab.
I'm going to sit back here. The fumes and gears are getting to me.
I paused and looked at him. It's nearing midday. The sun is blazing. You'll get a stroke.
I'll have greater latitude to photograph from back here.
He climbed over the lorry's railing and wedged his hat to give him maximum shade. As adults, children, and feral dogs scattered, we went on our way once again. We stopped 3 hours later at the next police checkpoint on the outskirts of Asyut. He hastily climbed down, dragging his backpack.
I have terrible cramps. I need a toilet right away.
The sergeant pointed to a police hut on the side of the road. George rushed off, dropping his backpack at my feet. Ignoring me, the sergeant cleared the driver to continue his journey. Salam alaikum. I showed him the letter. He nodded. How far to Beni Haram?
Beni Haram?
Yes, I want to visit my family.
Direction to Beni Haram.
A lanky police officer speaking in the dialect of Beni Haram looked me up and down, for I was wearing trousers, an open shirt, and a floppy hat, instead of a galabeya and a cotton turban wrapped about a skull cap. He waved down the road.
A few kilometers. A doubt strikes of the next village. Take a right along the canal leading into the next village.
His gaze went from me back to his sergeant.
Who is asking?
Me, cousin of the Omda. I gave him my name.
Ah, welcome.
I smiled, just as George charged out of the hut.
We've got to get out of here right now. I didn't make it, and it's all over their toilet floor.
Fortuitously, a lorry drew up and we climbed into the cabin while the sergeant instructed the driver to drop us off at the canal, some distance along the road. The happy driver took us toward our destination, while poor George gripped an abdomen twisting from Pharaoh's revenge, and I worried whether that sergeant would remember my name.
Hey, boat owner. You know how valuable your time on the water is. Sea breezes and salty air settle your mind like nothing else, right? But are you in the boat you really want? If it's time to try something new, then it's time you met Charles Zeitz of Pop Yachts. Charles not only brings a buyer to your existing craft, he also listens to your heart's desire and finds you the boat of your dreams. Pop Yachts is the largest boat and yacht broker in all of North America. People come to them every day looking for a craft to buy or sell. Why not sell yours and get what you really want? Go to facebook.com/NaplesMarcoYachts to learn more and get in touch. That's facebook.com/NaplesMarcoYachts.
It did not take long before our driver pulled off at the canal the checkpoint sergeant had indicated. We got off, started walking westward, parallel to the canal on the compacted, nutrient-rich alluvial mud. George dragged wearily behind. Within 100 meters, the blaring noise of traffic and horns vanished as a dense growth of sugarcane towered above us. The eerie silence, the flow of the desert wind, swaying gently through the vegetation. The ripple of Nile water in the canal reminded me of the serenity of walking through the woods in Germany. Except here, the sun beat down and the flies were endless. We tacked along until we spied canopies of a date palm forest. At the outskirts of the village, we were met by a horde of noisy, barefoot children in galabeas. When I responded with Salam Aleikum, they approached and touched us as if on a dare. A smiling young man met us, hand outstretched.
Dr. Marwan, how are you? I am Hakim. Do you remember me? We met before when you were little.
We embraced and exchanged the traditional Arab 3 cheek kisses, for Hakim was one of my distant cousins. How is your father, the Omda? He beamed with delight at the recognition and, just like Sit Nazifa, repeatedly said the word Nawartuna. You light up my day, as we proceeded into the village. As more and more villagers appeared, George and I frequently heard this affable and welcoming greeting from the growing crowd of relatives and those who claimed to know Sheikh Amin or my father. They took our backpacks. I translated the greetings and the general tidings to George, who momentarily cheered up, allaying his anxiety of meeting strangers. There had been several changes since my family last described Beni Haram's rural community life. The government had brought electricity to the village. I marveled at the advances that Nasser's government had made, medical clinics and freshwater diesel pumps. The date palms towered over sun-backed men with calloused hands and lithe bodies, my distant relatives. The sea of galabeas and white turbans advanced toward us. The swarm of excited children and feral dogs outnumbered the few women, wives in their black malayas, the younger ones wearing colorful dresses. In a hot melee of humans covered in sweat and dust from the unpaved dirt roads, we arrived outside an octagonal building at the heart of the village, which had been hastily converted from a community center into our temporary living quarters. As we settled in the cool building, George rushed to the toilet, the dry, squatting type. Someone quickly brought a sulfasomidine antibiotic and anti-diarrhea pills handed out by a pharmacist from the village dispensary. There was no village physician. Despite my experience the week before with the military zebra court, I wondered, could this be an entree for me? A cool Pepsi washed down the unleavened bread, feta cheese, and small peeled cucumbers offered us. A servant took our clothes, and on leaving, locked the door. I lay down on a cotton-filled mattress set on floor matting, fatigued by our travels and overcome by the early afternoon heat. George, showered and wearing fresh clothes, looked about the village through the open windows, feeling somewhat revived. Our building sat in the shade of a clump of palm trees, beyond which were emerald alfalfa fields, with flocks of white ibises pecking at insects in the Black Nile silt, deposited in the delta over millennium.
We're prisoners here. Look, they've posted a guard with a gun slung over his shoulders. He's pacing about the building.
I looked out. It's the Ghafir, the village guard, sent to protect us. His gun must be at least 50 years old. I doubt he has ammunition. It's a show of respect.
We don't have our clothes. We can't even escape.
Relax, George. We're among my people, my folks. No harm will come to us. I fell asleep, the serenity of the surrounding silence palpable. We awoke with the muezzin's call for early evening prayers. It came across a loudspeaker, another upgrade. Throwing back the shutters, I saw the red sun nudge its way over the distant furrows of fertile soil, dotted with white ibises. A murmuration of birds swooped over the fields. The evening air felt cool. A young man returned our cleaned clothes. They had even pressed our trousers and polished our shoes. The Omda, wearing a clean white galabea over his impressive paunch, amber prayer beads in hand, and accompanied by some of his sons, came to visit. He was a younger and portlier version of Sheikh Amin, and equally tall. Sporting a heavy beard, he had the dark face and broad nose characteristics of sturdy Saidi peasant stock. I took an immediate liking to him, for we were kin, and his good nature comforted me. An influential village chief, his duties included being the arbitrator over contested water rights and domestic disputes. He held forth in the octagonal building, sitting cross-legged on a straw mat in his fine galabea. He listened to his constituents, making Solomonic decisions to maintain the peace, although the decisions were not legally binding. Following lavish and gracious greetings, hugs and kisses for me and warm handshakes for George, we sat on cushions around a large copper tray set in our midst on the floor. It was laden with a delicious meal of lamb and chicken, rice, bamia, okra stew, with side dishes of tahini and torshi, pickled vegetables, and piles of unleavened bread. After the traditional benediction of Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful, for any activity done without his remembrance is tarnished, we tucked into the delicious meal specifically prepared in our honor. Sitting cross-legged around the tray, we ate with our hands. Etiquette demanded that we use our right hand, scooping up food with the baladi bread, unleavened country bread, while the left one was reserved for toilet ablution. We quenched our thirst with fresh water, filtered from open-necked ulas, clay water jars, rounding off the meal with the buffalo yogurt and sweet black tea, all accompanied by the constant swatting of ubiquitous swarming flies. George had to visit the bathroom several times. I explained to the concerned Omda that George had picked up a bug in Cairo and thanked him for the medications generously provided earlier. He nodded his head sympathetically, asked about our medical studies and how we knew each other. In turn, I asked questions to confirm what I knew about his brother, Sheikh Amin, about Sit Nazifa, my grandfather's second wife, and why my father had been banished to a distant relation in Cairo when he was 6 years old. It was less an interrogation than a meandering and clarification of family lore. He answered hesitantly. Perhaps he was unaccustomed to questions. More likely, his hesitation signaled his searching for diplomatic replies. Frequently, he repeated the question, as if mulling it over, or exploring some remote crevasse of a distant memory. I could not help wondering, as he spoke, if he was scanning for traces of my father in his nephew. I didn't look like the rest of the clan. Was he thinking I did not belong? Since our conversation was in Arabic, George excused himself and, accompanied by a young man, explored the village, camera in hand, as daylight receded into a soft, warm evening. The sun set over desert hills that hemmed in the green Nile Valley. I took the opportunity to ask the Omda 2 more questions that had been on my mind. When was Sheikh Amin born?
I was 8 years younger, so he must have been born 1260 Hijra or thereabout.
He paused, looking up at the wooden ceiling, mumbling to himself and clicking his prayer beads.
Around 1879 to 1882, I think. Registering birth wasn't customary. You know, at that time many infants died.
I nodded, trying to calculate how old my grandfather, or Giddy, as I fondly called him in Arabic, would have been at his death. As we sipped our tea in silence, I wondered how to pose my next question. What did the family think of my father marrying a foreign woman? He nodded his head slowly, shifting his weight on the cushion.
My brother, your Giddi, God bless his soul, and I often talked about this matter when he came for his annual summer visit. As long as she was Muslim and lived with the Meguid family, we agreed that Abdul Aziz, God bless his soul, should have his happiness. Your father was brilliant and a good judge of character. He was also somewhat of an idealist, thinking that he and others of his generation could modernize Egypt after 1952 revolution. You know, he wrote a biography of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who came from Upper Egypt and was a Sa'idi like us. Your father was very successful in facilitating the development of modern standard Arabic. Sad, really, for it minimized the use of the Sa'idi dialect in our schools and for our children.
He paused. I waited, hoping he would continue.
Madame Nadia.
This was my mother's Muslim name.
I heard is a good woman, but difficult. She had thick blood, you know, always serious. She was very strict with the young girls we sent as servants to help in the kitchen and care for you. She is not like us. We have thin blood, always joking and laughing. She never came to visit.
He paused once more, as if weighing his words.
It would have been helpful had she learned some Arabic, understood our culture better and mixed more with us, you know. I mean my brother's family in Saida.
He pointed in the general direction of distant Cairo. After yet another pause, he looked away.
How is Madame Nadia?
The question hung in the air. I left it unanswered. After the evening meal, the village men promenaded in the fresh air, sat in coffee houses, smoked their shishas, and generally shimel hawa, smelled the breeze, recovering from a day's work in the field. Radio music blared from cafes, while in others, men sat about a small black and white TV, watching an over-dramatized serial. The women stayed at home, and bands of young children, all boys, still roamed over the silt-compacted mud in the rutted streets. I felt very comfortable among my folks, the Saidi people, who appeared uncomplicated, down-to-earth, hard-working, and trustworthy. They told me anecdotes I had heard in different versions from the Cairo clan. Their generosity in giving me family photographs, particularly of my grandparents and my father, overwhelmed me. We turned in early. Once more George expressed his concern. The door was locked from outside, and the Ghafir had resumed his patrolling. I, on the other hand, felt cherished and valued. I, the son of Abdelaziz and the grandson of Sheikh Amin, the young doctor, whose roots lay in this fertile soil, was protected. As Jesus told his followers and other simple people during the Sermon on the Mount, "Ye are the salt of the earth." So too were my Saidi relatives, whose bloodline and DNA were rooted deep in ancient times. Despite the pride in my heritage, though, despite the kindness of my people, I still wondered, did I belong? We awoke to pristine air. George and I accompanied the Omda and a horde of curious children for a walk through the community. Villagers flooded into the street and crowded about me to shake my hand and repeated again and again, "Dr. Marwan, Dr. Marwan." Some grasped my right hand and kissed it before I could pull it away. The women who approached greeted me with high-pitched tongue trills, signaling a native son had returned. Although they recognized me as my father's son, I was uneasy with their acceptance. As we wound through the village, we passed a small adobe Coptic church with a token steeple. 10 to 30% of Egyptians are members of this distinct Christian community. Further along the alley, we ended up in the village's dispensary. The pharmacist greeted me enthusiastically, having heard from the Omda that I had floated the idea of setting up a practice after I graduated. The facility was modest: a waiting room, a consult room, a native toilet with a sink, and a small room that was their pharmacy by the meager stock of medications which lay exhibited on 3 shelves. The pharmacist was apologetic as he showed me around and answered my questions.
A physician comes from Asyut, the capital of the province, twice a month.
What happens in emergencies? In urgent cases?
Naturally, if it's an emergency, the patient goes to Asyut to see the doctor or his assistant. We can only do simple surgical cases here.
I see.
Usually, we get antibiotics and other medicines very quickly, in 2 or 3 days.
He smiled, looking at the Umda for signs that he had his approval.
Inshallah, God willing, when you come, we can get an anesthetic machine.
Inshallah. We shook hands, and the Umda, George, and I shuffled back out into the morning sun, followed by our entourage of villagers and curious onlookers. I joined family members for Friday communal prayers at the small mosque. Unlike my father, who educated himself at the Madrasa of Al-Azhar, the centuries-old Cairo mosque and the premier center of Sunni Islam, I had no formal schooling in religion. Life in the village came to a stop as ablutions were performed. We lined up, shoulder to shoulder, and barefoot on reed mats, facing Mecca, and recited our prayers, facing God and prostrating to Him in humility. At the end of our prayers, while kneeling, I exchanged greetings and shook hands with my granduncle and a cousin who flanked me while bestowing blessings on each other. After this closeness, I had the distinct sense that they now viewed me not as Khawaga, but as family. At the generous Friday meal at the Umda's home, we were overwhelmed with presents. I received a small Quran, some amber prayer beads, and a lavishly woolen prayer mat. George got a basket of sweet dried dates. I regretted not having gifts of our own to offer. After further embraces, kisses, promises to return soon, and wishes of God take care of you, my cousins accompanied us out of the village, followed by a crowd of the curious. At the main road, they hailed us an intercity bus. We boarded, and then waved our goodbyes through the open window as we headed for Luxor. George, his cramps under control, if not exactly cured, was excited that we were going to be tourists. We checked into the youth hostel on the east bank of the Nile. While falling asleep, I reflected on the last couple of days, hearing the Umda's intimate thoughts about my father.
He was also somewhat of an idealist, thinking that he and others of his generation could modernize Egypt.
Was I an idealist, like my father? Perhaps England would be better for me than the land of my father, where I'd be swimming upstream against ingrained, conservative cultural norms. By 6 a.m. we were roused and expected to clear out with the other young men by 8 a.m. The youth hostel's door would then be locked until 5 p.m. We rented bicycles and crossed the Nile in a precarious-looking boat that had seen better days. The oarsmen rowed mightily and with great skill, negotiating the swift current which swept us downstream toward the opposite bank. We wheeled onto the shore, then pedaled uphill with the sun beating down as we sweated our way to the Valley of the Kings. George insisted on seeing as many tombs as possible. Halfway through the morning, I wearied, having no historical context for the tombs and the various pharaohs. I sat on a rock, waiting for George and watching the queues of tourists file past, while the colourful hawkers peddled their trinkets and books of the pharaonic dynasties. I felt like a tourist instead of an Egyptian in my own land. At the English school in Cairo, we were taught English history, the successions of kings and queens. No mention was made of our own glorious past, of Egypt's ancient history. George brought me back here, though, and I learned Egyptian history at last. We visited several local museums, the Great Colossi of Memnon, and the Palace of Queen Hatshepsut, the first female pharaoh. In the small fishing village of Marsa Alam on the Red Sea, there was no youth hostel, So we settled on the deserted beach. Sweaty from our 2-hour mid-morning bus ride from Luxor, we quietly changed into our swimsuits and waded into the calm sea, deliciously warm and refreshing. Floating on the surface, I admired the colorful tropical fish swimming along the coral reefs, the rays of light glowing playfully on the shallow sea bottom. In the warm afternoon sun, I stepped on a spiky mollusk. I pulled the spike out of my heel and gently placed the mollusk into my backpack. Nighttime came quickly near the equator.
What do you think? Should we make the beach our home for the night?
I think we won't find a better spot in all of Egypt. We settled ourselves onto the warm sand beneath a canopy laden with stars.
Look there. It's the Southern Cross. You know, I never imagined I'd see it in Egypt. We must be quite far south.
He drifted off. Cocooned in a beautiful Egyptian night, I did the same. In the morning, we dove back into the crystal turquoise sea, swimming around the coral reefs in the shallow water. George needed to return to England, so we hitched a ride on an ancient, rickety old Bedford lorry traveling toward Suez. The blacktop ribbon stretched north, hewn out of desert cliffs that dropped precipitously into boulders of the sea. The engine labored up hills, and the lorry rolled uncontrollably downhill. Fortunately, we were the only vehicle around. Alarmed at the Nubian driver's lack of skill and the absence of brakes, we calculated our chances of escaping unharmed if he rolled into the sea. We reckoned the odds of jumping free might be better, so we climbed into the back to sit on tarpaulins in the glaring sun. By the time we arrived on the outskirts of Suez, we were sunburned, dehydrated, and glad to jump off. We spent the last of our funds riding an air-conditioned express bus back to Cairo, the height of luxury. A week later, at the airport, I emphatically presented the military exemption certificate to the immigration officer. Amazingly, he showed no interest. When I complained and told him the litany of my troubles, he said, "Ma'alesh, never mind." It annoyed me like hell. How could Ma'alesh justify all the anxiety and hell that the military tribunal had imposed? They had thrown my life into turmoil over this. Where were the laws and order of the oldest bureaucracy in the world? I had become someone who prioritized personal freedom above autocratic, nonsensical laws. I had come to value, even fall in love with, the freedoms of the West.
The trip with George made me more aware of the tenuousness of my ties to Egypt. I loved meeting and connecting with the members of my father's lineage. I was frustrated, however, by the complacency of Cairo kin. I'd die in Egypt of the inept bureaucracy. Most of all, the loss of my home in Zamalek made me feel dispossessed. I thought the odds of returning to Egypt were small, so while I began in Cairo with isolation and frustration, I ended with a sense of resolution and peace. At least part of me belonged here. Not all. It would never be all, but part. How that part played into what was to come, I could hardly imagine.
Thanks for listening to this project from 1C Productions, where thought-provoking media comes alive. Be sure to check out other 1C shows like Freevangelic, in which a married couple discuss their walk out of lifelong evangelicalism and into a new way of being. Their search for truth might open doors for you as well. Learn about Freevangelic and other 1C Productions podcasts at just1c.com. That's JUSTONEC.com.
You've been listening to Making the Cut from 1C Productions. Making the Cut was written, produced, and directed by Rebecca Seitz, based on Michael Meguid's manuscript, Mastering the Knife. Noah James played Michael Meguid. Other roles were brought to life by the voice talent of Richard Bunn, Ahmed Al-Janaid, Joe El Hagi, and Ellie Margi. Audio engineering provided by Zisher LLC. Making the Cut theme music by Kyle J. Baker. Learn more at makingthecutpodcast.com.